we'll get started. Lovely. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining tonight's discussion. This evening we have Emily J. Brooks and Jessica Vander Leahy in conversation discussing Emily's new book, The First Move. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before we begin this evening, I'd just like to reiterate a bit of the information that was sent to you in my email earlier with the link to tonight's event. So you've all automatically been placed on mute and you'll remain so throughout the evening. But we will be having a Q&A session towards the end of the evening. And in order for you to ask Emily your questions, we'd like you to use the chat box in order to send them through to me, and I'll read them out when prompted to do so by Jessica. So if you can't find the chat box, it should be towards the bottom left of your screen. Your questions will come straight through to me, and as I said, I'll read them out when I'm prompted to do so. So I'd also like to mention that we have a special promotion for everyone in attendance tonight, and that is if you use the code EVENT at checkout on our website, then you'll receive 10% off all orders placed within the next 24 hours. So I'll be sharing the link to purchase your copy of The First Move shortly, and I recommend that you get in nice and early purchasing your copies to make the most of that discount as well. And so I'd now like to introduce Emily J. Brooks. Emily is a writer and editor. Formerly, she was the editor of Future Women, an organisation dedicated to the advancement of women. She was also an associate editor at the Huffington Post Australia and a journalist at the Australian Women's Weekly. Emily's work has appeared in Grazia, the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, among other places. And in conversation with Emily tonight is Jessica Vander Leahy. Jessica is an Australian model, writer and presenter. She has written for Cosmopolitan, Elle, Body and Soul, Women and News.com.au, among other places. While she grew up in Sydney and her home of Papua New Guinea, the nature of her work has shaped her into a professional nomad who regularly spends time in New York, London and Los Angeles. So I would now like to hand over to Emily and Jessica, who are, very fortunately, both together this evening. So welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're so excited to be joining you all. And in case it's not clear, I'm Jess. This is Emily. We have come dressed matching tonight, but that was entirely not on purpose.
It was completely unintentional, but very fortuitous.
Yeah. So I am very privileged to be interviewing my friend Emily here. We actually met when we were working both together at the Australian Women's Weekly some years ago. And I've always known that Emily was a very talented writer, and I knew she had a book coming for some time, so it's very nice to be able to hold it in my hot little hand. And what a hot colour it is.
It is a hot colour.
It's something that you can miss if you guys go past it in an airport where I always buy my books, or a bookshop or avid reader, of course. So I guess my first question for you, Emily, is it's a book about love. And love is a topic that has been discussed since basically the dawn of time, since humans learned how to write a song or a book or, you know, a movie. So I wanted to know what you thought felt needed to be said on the subject of love in this day and age.
Well, I wrote this book because I had a question that I needed to answer, and that was whether successful women faced a penalty in romance. So do men avoid dating women more successful, more ambitious, more educated than themselves? And that question was kind of stuck in my head for a few years because of a couple of things. The first being when we worked at the Australian Women's Weekly together, I was first assistant to the editor-in-chief. And when people worked out what I did, they always hit me with two questions. And they're exactly the same every time. And they were, is she married? Does she have kids? And I just thought that's your first question. Yeah. They didn't ask about her leadership skills. They didn't ask what she was like as a person. Mm-hmm. And it just became very clear to me that both women and men, young and old, didn't think success and love coexist for women as it does for men. And then as I grew up in Sydney, I collected more girlfriends, and they're all very successful, but they all struggled in romance, as did I. And then I stumbled upon some research that confirmed it. And so women have historically suffered a huge dateability penalty, is what I call it. In
I like that turn of phrase.
Yes.
Dateability penalty.
The dateability penalty.
Write that down. She did.
And I did. And over the course of my research, I actually discovered that the dateability penalty is fading. So there's actually a lot of good men out there that are partnering with women with a higher status than themselves. But the problem is shifting now. But the problem we've got now is that there's good men out there, but there's not enough good men as there are successful women. So that's the kind of fun tension that we sit with. And then on top of that, women have developed this kind of odd social reflex. So we talk ourselves down in romance to appear more attractive, or maybe just to make men feel more comfortable.
Yeah, the intimidation factor.
Yeah,
which we will get to. But I did want to just quickly talk about part of, early on in the book, you quote Henry Thoreau, and you sort of say in the first couple of pages that you can only really create from the narrowness of your own experience. And that's true of all artists, especially ones that have tried to write about love, because it is such a personal experience. And you're coming from a cis, white, heterosexual woman experience. And I guess you talk about love trying to live up to traditional heteronormative stereotypes, and how that's created some problems in the way that nowadays lots of people, heterosexual, on the whole spectrum of sexuality, how they want to experience relationships. And I would like to know, you mentioned about how same-sex and non-binary relationships are really leading the way forward for more equal relationships nowadays. Can you talk about some of the research that you found that supports that?
Yeah, so I found this kind of in the last third of writing the book, and it surprised me, but it didn't. But I guess in the 5 years since marriage equality was instated, it's given researchers some time to actually research same-sex married couples. And because they're the same gender, there's no gendered assumption in terms of who's going to do the dishes, who's going to do the housework. And
the load isn't assumed. Yeah.
So the unpaid work isn't automatically designated to someone because of their gender. And so because there's no room for assumption, it forces them to have a conversation, and so they communicate better. And that makes for a happier, more satisfied marriage.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it?
It's really interesting.
And I guess another thing I wanted to touch on was that this really isn't a traditional dating book. I guess like a lot of young women coming out writing a book about love, people would assume it's about how to find love, and it's for the Charlottes of the world. Yeah. Where, and I mean, can we ever move away from the Sex and the City references? I don't know. But I think it really is more so for the Mirandas of the world, because it is so research-based. And, while you do dive into anecdotes from, people in your sphere, it definitely is tackling a lot of feminist issues on the basis of like solid research. So was that intentional?
It was. I thought when I stumbled across this topic that I could turn it into a bit of a ruse to lure some young women in who may not automatically be thinking about feminism and equality in their day-to-day life. And so I've intentionally highlighted women and stories of women like Gloria Steinem and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Lizzo. And also talked about women's relationship with beauty and age and money, because how we feel about ourselves and how we operate in the world influences how we operate in romance as well. And if we're stronger and more confident in ourselves, that always flows on into romance. And if you're more sure of yourself, you're going to walk into a better relationship and maintain a better relationship for yourself. Yeah. So this book is as much about feminism as it is about love.
Yeah. And can you talk to me about, because you're saying when you want younger women to maybe start thinking about these kind of feminist issues so they have a greater identity of themselves before they go in. And I know that Jamila Wisby quotes Sheryl Sandberg on the cover saying, the single most important decision a woman can make is her choice of a life partner. Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that, as someone who has now done the research, do you think how long should someone spend on getting to know themselves before they go out choosing another half to themselves, or more than another half? I mean, who's to say monogamy is the right choice,
Well, I think it is tricky because I fell in love before I was ready, and I'm much more sure of myself now, 3 years into a relationship, than I was at the start. So I think it's different for everyone, and it does come down to your circumstance. But I think dating books throughout history and dating literature has focused so heavily for women on teaching women how to be desirable, how to be wanted, and that's where we've channeled our focus. And I don't think many ask, well, hey, what do you want? Hey, what do you desire? And so that messaging,
the female desires is still secondary. It's very much secondary to the goal of being in love or being in a relationship. Your pleasure is secondary.
And that comes down to history and our socialization, where 50 years ago we did have to find a partner to find any success in this world and be seen as an adult. To move out of our home and in with someone else, we need the man to co-sign a mortgage, we didn't have access to credit cards, we couldn't work beyond the roles of the nurse and the typist. So that while we don't need to find a man to gain success in this world, I think that the messaging and dating literatures lag behind.
It's there wasn't a real acknowledgement of agency, whereas now there really is. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's still a pay gap, there's still a lot of inequality, but I think that there is a lot more agency. And so the texts, even in the 90s, that were dealing with that. I mean, you go back and you mentioned, you look at Sex and the City, you look at lots of things that were heavily focused on just dating, and it wasn't a huge acknowledgement of women's agency that has come leaps and bounds. Still not equal.
Yes,
but
exactly. And even in the 90s with the rules, they said that yes, women are more independent now, but our independence was the problem. So we had to adopt more passive strategies in romance in order to attract a man. Whereas this book basically tells you the opposite. Because we also know that there's good progressive men out there, and there's also some men with really traditional stereotypes and beliefs. And if women continue talking themselves down, they're going to position themselves or align themselves with those traditional men instead of the progressive men. So if we talk ourselves up in front of men in romance, it kind of sifts out the good men from the bad for you.
Because there is that kind of sense of a lot of I know that the more information someone has about you while they're dating you, sometimes you can feel like you're getting critiqued, in certain ways. And there's that great AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, recently. Actually, I don't know how recently she said it, but the meme was doing the rounds, obviously, since that whole awful incident with her and that very sexist senator who I'm waiting. Yeah. But it was just sort of talking about how women do get critiqued. The more you expose yourself, the more opinions you have, the more you share about yourself, the more you can be critiqued into submission. You know what I mean? The more someone can then say, well, this is what I think about you and your opinion. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got to talk ourselves up, and even though it might result in some rejection, at least you're working it out on date 2 instead of 2 years in.
Well, at least the rejection is based on, something.
Yeah, something that you want.
That you want it. Yeah. Like, it's your opinion. You shouldn't be, that opinion's going to come out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, eventually, you can't hide that if you're going to try and live authentically.
Yeah.
So,
exactly.
or those beliefs. And I sort of wanted to talk about how you write this book, and I don't want to skip right to actually, one thing I did want to ask you before I ask that question is, you come across a lot of research and a lot of, I'm sure, anecdotal dating tips from, years gone by, as we just touched on. But what was some of the worst? Because I know that there's sometimes some of those shocking memes that pop up of like old school, like
the
tips.
worst dating advice. Oh, that's hard.
Did you see
anything in the rules?
What?
Basically, you just got to resort to such passive strategies, and not take any kind of agency in your romantic life.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
Oh, that's okay. That's all right. I'm sure that's a lot that's terrible. I'll send you some links.
Yes. You're welcome to share.
I actually wanted to talk about, and I don't want to skip right to the end of the book, but I think it's so interesting and I want to get into the juiciness of it. The fact that you ended the book on talking about singledom. Why did you do that? Can you speak to that choice?
I wanted to end the book on that because I think so many dating books and so many romantic comedies end on us finding the guy and it's the happy ending. And by not ending on being single, that implies that that's not a happy ending. And all the research is showing now that there's a rise in women's singledom and women choosing to live marriage-free and child-free lives, and they're perfectly happy. Yeah. And I think so many women struggle in dating so much because they fear being single.
Yeah. Well, and I mean that's real, because you still have a lot of, I love Chelsea Handler. I think she's amazing, but it's beyond how often I feel like she has to defend the choice to remain not have kids. I mean, look at every sad cover of Jennifer Aniston. Poor sad Jen, and it's just complete. It's a valid and it's a valid choice, and it's really not to necessarily remain single, but to not fill out those traditional gender stereotypes.
And I think it means, I think we can now treat singledom as a choice, not a state of waiting. And that's what I write in the book. But there's some really interesting stats around single person households are going to rise the fastest out of any other household over the next 30 years.
Yeah, wow.
But also there's some research around women's happiness and satisfaction levels, and single women are equally as happy as women that are married, and sometimes single women are happier. Yeah. But we know that a greater indicator of someone's general happiness is the amount of friends they have, and good friendships they have over that, that wielded more influence in their life over having a partner or not.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. Greater, what single households are going to rise by over 30. That's pretty intense.
Over the next 30 years.
Oh wow. What other interesting tidbits that shocked you? But it is, it's so research based. Like it really isn't just like so if he says this, say this. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's so intensely researched.
Well, I think one of the most interesting bits of research I found was research by Kathleen Gerson out of New York. And it was in terms of women and men's attitudes in terms of their relationships. And they were all asked, what do you want in your relationship? And they all said, I want an equal relationship. And then she asked them, well, if you can't have that, what do you want? And all of the majority of men said, just reverted to a male breadwinner model. And the majority of women went, I want an equal relationship or I'll go it alone.
Yeah.
And so that's the really interesting tension that we sit with. And a lot of women are willing now to go, I want equality or I'm not in.
Hence the 30% rise in singledom.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But actually, just very quickly, the other reason I wanted to write this book was when we were at the Weekly, we were surrounded by the Caroline Overingtons of the world. And so many female and male journos in their 30s and 40s. And they were having such interesting conversations around equality in their relationships and unpaid work and emotional labour and how do you manage that juggle with the kids and your husband. And I walked into that every day, and then I went home and went out to drinks with my girlfriends, and I just felt like we weren't talking about that. So I wanted to bring that conversation that we were having at the Weekly to young women in their 20s. So they started thinking about it earlier, so they set themselves up better.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that work environment was very interesting for me to see. Like, you know, it was my first grown-up work environment, and to see how men and women juggled with families. Like, you know, the amount of times we'd sit there and we could overhear someone on the phone to their kids, you know, talking them through booking a license test or whatever, or, you know, Bryce would bring his 2 little kids in, and that was so good. And, you know, like it was a very well set up environment, I think, for people to be able to exist not just in the career space, but in the family space, and not a judgment of it being male or female in terms of, you know, it was just an open space to be like, you know, with choices of relationships and whatnot comes emotional load, whether you have children or not, you know, whether you're a man or a woman. I think it was a really big learning for me to be able to see that. It was humanizing. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, and I think because it was female weighted in there, the men were more comfortable to bring in their kids and and it probably encouraged them because they were hearing other perspectives. To take more responsibility. In terms of raising their families.
Yeah. I also wanted to talk about you writing this book during a pandemic. That's right. I mean, you didn't write it during, but it's coming out during a pandemic. And just what you said before in regards to people being happier on the basis of like connections with friends. And, you know, I feel, you know, I feel a lot of people probably who are single are being challenged in this time, especially if they do live alone and they're not in a relationship and they physically cannot have company right now. You know what I mean? Whether, you know, it's just someone to, who knows what you need company.
No, I've got a lot of single girlfriends. And I think it is harder on you if you're single right now. And I never expected this book to come out during this time when, well, some people can't even go out on a date and exercise some of the advice in there. But, I do actually think in a way this is the perfect time for this book to come out because it asks some really big questions of women. And I think you need space to reflect on how you operate in the world and how you answer some of those questions for yourself. So I think this moment's allowing us a little bit of space and then we can go out into the world and operate differently.
Fingers crossed.
fingers crossed. And I also hope, I'm pretty hopeful in terms of how this pandemic will change humans' behaviour. And I do just hope that we will all have more empathy for each other, particularly in dating. And I think before the pandemic, we were just kind of paralysed by choice. There were so many options out there, whether it was in terms of your career or in terms of women or men you could partner with. And I just hope that kind of paralysis dies down a little bit, and we become more grateful for things that they don't have to be perfect anymore, and the grass isn't always greener. And just for everyone to have a little bit more gratitude around whatever relationship they stumble upon.
Connection. Connection is good. Connection is a good flow. Actually, do you know what's so interesting? So we talk about like single people probably struggling, but then there's people who are in relationships who are locked inside.
Yeah,
someone who they're challenged.
Yeah.
And actually, have you been listening to Esther Perel's?
I haven't listened to
season 2.
Season.
Well, man, it is a lot, and she's got these couples. So basically, if you guys haven't, buy Emily's book, but if you're going to read listen to another sacred text, it is Esther Perel's COVID.
I do actually quote Esther Perel.
Yeah, you do
so
actually.
Cross-promotion.
Yes, that's true. But her COVID therapy sessions with these partners who were like in lockdown with each other, and they hate it. And it's like so interesting listening to, I guess, the kind of language that they're having to read, because you can't leave. You can't just get up and be like, I'm out of here, because you can't. So it's kind of like they're completely changing their relationships, like whether it's completely over and they have to learn how to be friends in that same house, or, and I think that that's really interesting. And it's hugely, well, the thing is, and because your book is based in so much study, but did you learn anything about like, how people can best talk about love and talk about, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of research, but like, it's also a feeling. It's so inexplicable. Like there's a spark. Like, what did you learn about that?
I think the love that I talk about that's kind of a hopeful call for this type of love is teammate love. And that is a love based on real negotiation, not kind of gendered assumption. And I think we often avoid big conversations because we don't want to have conflict in our lives. But this love means that you have to have a conversation a lot of the time.
You have to lean into being uncomfortable.
Yeah, because the love that I talk about, it's a love not just based on personal respect, but professional respect. And that means passing the ball of opportunity back and forth to one another. And respecting what your teammate does when they've got the ball. And you have to have a conversation about who's going to have the ball and how long they're going to have it for. Instead of a woman continuously compromising her career and her ambitions and her desires. And that's what we fall into, that trap a lot. Because we're having this conversation now, but this conversation has been had, I would say, in older female generations for a very, very, very long time.
Do you think men can get a lot out of reading a book like this?
So I've actually had a few men write to me and say they got so much out of it. But what we actually know is that equal relationships now are happier, more satisfied relationships than any other type of relationship. But what is really interesting is that 30 years ago, equal relationships were not the happiest, most satisfying relationships because of the pressures and rules in society. So my mum and dad have had a traditional relationship. Mum works now, but it wouldn't have been the happiest relationship if they had an equal relationship when they were raising us, which I just find so interesting. But it's because times have changed so much it's now allowing us to have equal relationships and capitalize on them.
I like how you talked as like, despite your mum having a very traditional relationship with your dad, you know, but she was primarily raising three girls, and your dad was working. I like how you talked about sort of not being encouraged to be boy obsessed or you know, love obsessed in the playground, which I think is really interesting because I was sort of raised the same. My mum was never one to be like, oh, did you? I remember once I remember once telling her I kissed a boy and she told me that's how you catch freckles. So like I was like told like no, like, you know, it wasn't encouraged. And I think that you were raised the same way. So like how does a girl who was raised with ambition to have to lust after so many other things write about love?
Well, that's the interesting thing. And I talk about at the start of the book, I've always thought dating is a really trivial, kind of stupid thing.
Yeah.
And I always just kind of threw it off the table. And when my girlfriends would talk about it, I wouldn't really want to talk about it. I was like, let's talk about something important. But then
it was totally unimportant to you.
It was totally unimportant to me. But I also think I was dealing with heartbreak and I was just like, everyone sucks. But once I started looking into this question, I realized that I'd been wrong the entire time, and who we choose to live our life with is one of the most important decisions that we'll make in our lifetime. And I've actually got a professor in here saying that picking the right partner is as important as picking the right degree or the right first job. It's hugely influential and impactful on our lives. You're either going to have someone that supports you and what you do, or someone that won't. So it's actually a really serious topic, and I think when we get into marriage, everyone does treat it as serious, but before marriage, everyone thinks of it as some kind of flimsy, whimsical, silly thing.
Well, I think when you're talking about marriage, yes, like love is, you know, marriage is a choice that is beyond, I mean, you have to get the government involved, basically, like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how many people really want to get married these days, but then you have to give the government a reason as to why it didn't work out. If indeed it doesn't, which, you know, statistically, but I'm trying not to be negative. But it's just interesting, though, that when you talk about, yes, love in terms of marriage, I guess you are choosing to, make it kind of official in the way that you have to make a life with this person on paper and not just, you know, in your heart and in your feelings, like, you know, which you can do with someone on holidays and, you know, it can feel like love or whatever. But when it's, you know, love in a marriage, I guess what you're saying about having someone who's going to support you in your career and your choices is, what did your research say about having too much expectation for your partner? Even though you're talking about teamwork love, like, you know, do they have to be the person you love and the person you make love with, and then the person who is
that actually
helps you in the house?
This is where I quote Esther Perel. And she said, we've never had higher expectations of our partner, and we expect them to be someone that makes things exciting and erotic, but also someone that keeps us safe and cares for us. And
is our priest. I mean, you know, let's go to church.
And we kind of take everything that we once took from a big village and place all of that expectation on one person. And they can't fulfill that. So that's why your friendships are important. Your colleagues are important. What you do in your career is important. So I think we do have to be a bit kinder in terms of, or realistic in terms of the expectations. But the two kind of expectations or things I'm pushing in this book are connection and professional respect. And that's kind of the baseline foundation. Connection. For the love that I'm talking about. But I think Instagram's kind of seeing everyone's filtered lives has made us think that the grass is greener and that one person should be giving us everything.
Yeah, I think there is that expectation. Like they have to be the hottest person you've ever seen, the smartest person you've ever seen.
Yeah.
You know, they have to never make you jealous. They have to never make you cry. Like, you know, and if they do, they have to know how to make up for it perfectly. Like, you know what I mean? And it is a lot. And actually, that's what Esther's been talking about. And
actually,
in my head.
Michelle Obama talks about it with Barack. She said, having two people living separate lives, but separate lives together, and trying to walk that path together, and compromise along the way, but both still get what you want out of life is a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, totally.
Like, it's hard.
Well, that is crazy.
Yeah, well,
like they have done a good job.
They've done a very good job.
Right.
She's got the ball now.
Yeah. Mom and Dad, Barack and Michelle. Actually, everyone, I'm just going to remind you that we are going to have a Q&A at the end of this. So if anyone's got any questions for Emily, please put them in the chat box. And our host is going to very kindly filter through them and give us a few. So I guess one other question I just have, maybe just before we start taking questions from the audience is, will we ever get tired of the thrilling tastiness of dissecting love?
No, I don't think we will. I don't think we will.
And whether it be our own love or vicariously, how important is it to vicariously live through the, you know, saucy spiciness of other people's, you know,
I think there's
stories about love.
I guess there's just something deeply human about it. And I think one of the universal truths is that we all want to be loved and we all want to find that love and acceptance. And I don't think that's ever going to stop. And as long as that's never going to stop, we're never going to stop asking questions about it. Yeah.
Seriously.
And then the other universal truth, I think, is that we are all hurt in some way. So we all inflict pain on one another in other ways. So those two universal truths flipping around make for a very interesting.
Everybody loves and
time
everybody hurts.
Yeah, everybody loves and everybody hurts.
Yes. And actually, I'm just going to pop up this. This is me trying to be tech while still. I don't know if there's. Oh, I thought there was a message for us. No. Okay. Put that there.
Do we have any questions or not? Okay.
Yep, we've got one question, a couple of questions. It's from Kate Noonan. Kate says, hey, did the process of writing this book change your approach to your own relationships, both your romantic relationship and other relationships?
Yes, it did. Let me just think about that for a moment. That's a big one. I think the interesting thing through writing this book was I became more confident through the process, but I also think that's because I wrote this book over 3 years. And I started it at 25 and finished it at 28. And I'm much more sure of myself now. But I heard someone say this the other day, and I can't remember who it was, but they say, you teach what you need to learn and you write what you need to know. And it was only the other day that I kind of realized that I'd answered that big question for myself. But throughout the process, I'd kind of written what I deeply believed I needed in a relationship. And it comes back to that professional respect and that connection. And I have both those things. But yeah, it was only the other day that I kind of had that moment where I realized it actually worked out what I was trying to answer.
Were you nervous for your partner to read the book?
Yes, I was. But no, it went fine.
It went fine.
It went
But
fine.
was there anything you were just like, I guess?
No, do you know what? He actually read it more in, he's my editor. So he read it more in an editor's point of view.
Wonderful.
But maybe he was showing himself off. But yeah, it was, he just gave me his very honest edits.
He's a woke bloke.
He's
all right.
good. He's good.
Yeah. Is there any other reader question?
We haven't had any more audience questions yet, but I have a question if that's okay.
Yes.
I'm wondering, as a lot of us are still having to isolate at home, I'm wondering if you can give us some recommendations on your favourite movies or TV shows where women are really taking control in the way that you talk about and subverting these stereotypical ideas of relationships.
That's a big one.
I have one.
You
I know it's not mine. While she has thinking time, do you know what? I love a good rom-com. I think they're incredible. And I'm a sicko, and I'll still go back and watch some of the worst ones that are like truly sexist. But I still have, you know, some sort of nostalgia for them. You know, I don't think What Women Want was so bad with Mel Gibson. I think I watched it recently. I was like, oh, that's a lot.
It's like
some of it is a bit painful, but so because I do love a good rom-com, it was really nice to get a nice new one that I thought was really balanced and human and real to a kind of, you know, 2020 woman experience, which is called Someone Great. It's on Netflix. And it's got my crush, Lakeith Stanfield. I love him. And it's beautiful. It's a really wonderful movie, and it's very passionate, very gorgeous, and great soundtrack. So that's mine. So you go now.
I've got you giving me time now. Thank you. I would go back to the Nora Ephron classics if you haven't seen them recently. When Harry Met Sally, a classic, needs no explanation, and You've Got Mail. And if you haven't watched Fleabag, watch Fleabag, because every time I told someone that I was writing this book, they said, have you watched Fleabag? So I think there's a lot of similar kind of sentiments running through it.
I love that.
I don't think there's any books as well. I would also recommend Modern Romance by Aziz Ansari, just in terms of the dating dynamics, and particularly online dating. I found that very useful.
How did you find Normal People?
I loved the book. I didn't love the TV show.
Okay.
I think the whole plot, because it's slow moving and it's about those kind of intricate dynamics between the two of them, I think that comes through better in a novel than on TV. So I didn't love the TV show, but it might just be one of those things if you read the book, but not the TV show as much. Yeah. Just trying to think. Can I recommend some other just like general books?
Yeah, of course.
All my books are stacked up against the computer. I would recommend Play It As It Lays by Joan Didion. It's an absolute classic. It's a little bit depressing, but it's really worth it. And also highlights a lot about females' experience. I'd also recommend Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. It's a collection of essays by, she's a New Yorker staff writer, but she's got a couple of really good ones in there. There's 9 big essays, and one's about the internet, and it's just really interesting with the kind of cancel culture phenomenon we're in right now. It's a really interesting essay to read, and there's also another essay called Always Be Optimizing, which is about kind of women's relationship with beauty and capitalism, which is very, very good. And also Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, which is basically a novel with the entire premise of this book, and it's a novel about Hillary Clinton and what her life would look like if she never married Bill Clinton. And it was utterly fascinating. So I'd recommend that one.
Awesome, thank you. So those are all the questions that we've had come through. So I might hand back to you both for any final comments or questions that you have before I open up to everybody to say thanks. And
do we have anything else?
I guess, you know, what's the final thought that you'd like to have people, you know, feel when they are dating after reading this book? What's something that you want them to walk away with?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to own who you are and what you want, in every single scenario. And it's something that I have to tell myself over and over again as well. It's such a simple thing, but it's so hard for women to do sometimes because of the patriarchal society that we live in and the kind of gendered pressures that are pushing against us all the time. So that would be the biggest thing: own who you are and what you want, and go get it.
Sounds like good advice.
Yeah, it's very simple.
Sometimes easier said than done.
Yeah, exactly.
Read a book, you might get some tips. But yeah, I guess I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, we've actually had one more question come in, if that's okay. It's from Tina, and Tina says, not only in these COVID times, but also as we get older and our friends partner and have children, meeting people and potential partners becomes almost impossible. So how do we meet people? What are the options or recommendations?
Well, that is a big one. And I am 28, so I'm not going to pretend to know your experience. But I think it's about throwing yourself into different situations as much as possible. Online dating, obviously. And my advice with online dating is just go on a few dates. And if you're getting fed up with it, log off and just take a month off and treat it as a bit of a game, in the sense of like just trying to have a bit of fun with it. And then when you're getting to the point of being fed up, log off and take a break. Because what I've realized through writing this book and having all these conversations is not many women like dating, which I found really interesting, because I think it's kind of projected into the world that we love it. Yeah, so it would just be throwing yourself into different situations as much as possible, both online and in person, but it's very tricky right now during a pandemic.
Great, thank you. So that was the last question. So thank you both so much for the discussion tonight. It's been absolutely wonderful. It's been lovely having you both. I've sent the link a couple of times to purchase your copy of The First Move for everybody in attendance tonight. I'm going to post that again one more time. Don't forget to use that code at checkout, event, for 10% off on all of your on your whole order site-wide. I'm now going to take everybody off mute so that they can join me in thanking you both.
Oh, thank you.
Lovely. There you go. You're all off mute.
Nice to see everyone's faces.
We couldn't see anyone's faces before. It was
Thank you so much for tuning in. I know everyone's time is precious, so it means a lot to me.
Thanks very much, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.
Bye.